Hi, I'm Alicia Michelle, and as a trained and certified Christian mindset coach, I've helped hundreds of Christian women discover brain science-based mindset tools to help them grow closer to God and break free from anxiety, perfectionism, people-pleasing, and feeling like they're never enough. The Christian Mindset Coach is the award-winning podcast that shows you how to use simple brain science principles and biblical truth to renew your mind for lasting confidence, joy, and peace. I'm so glad you're here. Grab a cozy spot and let's get started. Hi there. Welcome to today's episode of the Christian Mindset Coach with me, Alicia Michelle. If you are a podcast listener and you're a woman, chances are that you have experienced some of the things we've talked about here. You've tried some of the ideas, and you might be thinking, this is fantastic. Like, I've learned a lot. And how do I bring that to my spouse? How do I share some of the things that I'm learning about with managing my emotions in a way that doesn't cause a fight? Have you ever experienced that where you're talking about, like, why can't you be more emotional? Or why can't you be, insert the word around emotions? And it just doesn't really work out the way you want. And so I wanted to have this conversation today with a friend of mine named Sathiya Sam, who is a coach to men around managing emotions. And he specifically works with men who are breaking free from porn addiction, since that's a huge issue in the area of emotions and things like that with guys. But he has so much insight on how men process emotions and how we as women can take what we are thinking and feeling and help our guys, share about things maybe in a way that feels safe to them, or present issues that might be emotionally triggering in a marriage, or maybe you've had fights around. How can we share these things in a way that doesn't cause more problems, but actually expands and blesses the relationship? And how can we do that from a Christ-centered perspective? So that you're listening to that, you might be thinking, whoa, that's a tall order, Alicia. And it is, absolutely. But I feel like there's so many nuggets in this conversation. I learned so much just listening to Sathiya and hearing his side of it as a man who has grown dramatically in this area of understanding his inner life, and can offer great insights into how we as women can help our guys in this area. So a little bit about Sathiya. He is the dynamic founder of Deep Clean, which is a coaching powerhouse liberating men from the grips of pornography addiction. With a background steeped in academia and interpersonal research, Sathiya brings a unique blend of intellect and empathy to the table. As an accomplished author, international speaker, and the mastermind behind the Man Within podcast, which you need to check out, he dives deep into the intersection of timeless principles and cutting edge science, guiding his audiences through an in-depth transformational process. With a decade of pastoral experience fueling his passion, Sathiya is on a mission to unleash the full potential in every individual, helping them lead lives of purpose, fulfillment, and freedom. So he is doing some great work with guys, specifically around the pornography side, but also as part of that, helping them understand their inner life. And so there is so much that we can glean from him. And so I'm excited to present to you this conversation with Sathiya. Well, hello, Sathiya. Thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Alicia. It's great to be here.
Yes. Well, today is a different kind of a conversation. Obviously, you're a man. We typically have women on the show, but we have had guys in the past, but not from this angle, which is what I'm really excited to talk about today. And we're going to be exploring this idea of how can we support guys in their emotional needs as spouses, as partners, as friends. So I am excited to hear your insight from working with men and working with women too, actually, what we can do to help men in these areas of emotional confidence. So first, let's just kind of start by saying, what are some of those big emotional challenges that guys face, especially from a Christian context?
Ooh, okay, loaded question. So, first thing would be that it's not manly to have emotions or to talk about emotions unless the emotion is anger. And that is probably the biggest mental hurdle that your typical Christian man in the Western world is going to experience. So, I think that's the first thing. The second thing would be a history of bad experiences when emotions have been expressed. Whether it was that the guys have shown emotions and then they were called a name, or sometimes it's just that they weren't validated properly. So I think that's another really big one. You sort of have this history of, no, I've done this before, so I'm not going to do it again. I just got hurt. It wasn't worth it. And then I think the last thing, which is sort of a offshoot of the other 2 points, is just a lack of role models, a lack of somebody demonstrating what it looks like to manage your emotions in a way that is healthy, masculine, and biblical. Sometimes you're lucky if you get maybe 1 or 2 of those, but to get all 3, very challenging. So I would say those are the main issues men are faced with.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. I can't tell you that there are many guys who reach out to me who say, "I would love to work with you to get help in these areas." And I personally work one-on-one with women right now,
Mhm.
but I don't have a resource necessarily to send them to because you're right, they're not all 3 of those things. I They need to be biblical, they need to be able to understand what guys are going through, and they need to be able to be willing to do that work, and there's just not a lot of people doing that work. So I'm grateful that you're out there talking about these things. I wanted to dig into that first one that you shared about anger. What makes this the most maybe politically correct for a guy to talk about, if we could use that term?
Yeah, I mean, and I would even just say socially, it just seems to be the most acceptable
Yeah.
because I think it looks masculine to be angry. I
Mm.
don't really know why that is, whether that's
Yeah.
media or, whatever. I mean, biblically, we know that God is rich in love and slow to anger, like it's part of his composition as well. But definitely, like the connotations, which are probably more media driven as I'm sort of verbally processing your question here. The connotations are being angry is masculine. Think of like the movie 300, the guys yelling, "This is Sparta." They're all wearing diapers and they got their
Yeah.
spears and they're like ready to conquer the world. It's kind of like that for some reason that is all good and masculine.
Yeah.
Or you watch your favorite athletes and they I'm in Canada where like we love hockey, right? And everybody just watches hockey to wait until the 2 guys fight. For some reason, anger is just totally okay. But as soon as it's like sadness, or grief, like seeing a guy crying it's portrayed differently. And we're kind of taught that something's wrong with that or it's a sign of weakness. And the messages are never that overt. And that's why this is such a big challenge for men, is because nobody ever told us that crying was the wrong thing to do. But somehow we got that message across, that
Yeah.
crying was for sissies and that if you cry, you're weak and all that kind of stuff. And so I would say it's a lot of the messages that we get, again, either from role models and our parental figures in the media, they all reinforce the same thing, that anger's masculine and nothing else really is.
Mm. I wonder too, and let me know what you think about this, but do you think it has to do with the fact that anger kind of in some sort of way could be portrayed as, I'm showing that I'm strong and I'm showing
Definitely.
that, yeah, and I'm showing that I'm being protective. Kind of those two core things that are important to guys.
Mhm, that's a really good point. Yeah, the protective part especially, like,
Yeah.
I mean, that's actually a beautiful thing about men, right? Is when they are protective, and sometimes that means you do get angry. I think that part's really beautiful. Obviously, we just know it's not the only element. And I think the other part is anger typically is associated with action. Men
Mm.
are very action oriented, and I know we're gonna get into kind
Right.
of like what men need to thrive in this area, like
Yeah.
emotionally, and this is
Yeah.
a huge part of it. When you think about processing grief or being sad or even maybe being like disgusted about something, it's not as tightly correlated with taking action. In fact, there's something to be said about being able to sit with those emotions, letting them kind of have their place, kind of like a wave that comes in and out. And that's not always men's first response. We're generally action takers and much more action oriented. So I think there's a couple pieces to the puzzle that make anger the, quintessential male emotion, and everything else seems to be second tier.
Wow. No, that is so interesting. You're right. It's action oriented. It's, I'm doing something about this. Whereas some of those other emotions that are challenging that we work through, they can feel very passive. Like, okay,
Mhm.
I'm sad. What am I doing about it though? How am I
Yeah,
fixing it? And
yeah.
I can hear how important that would be to a guy. So, how do you work with a guy who is action oriented like that, has that kind of a mindset, but how do you encourage them to step into some of these emotions that maybe feel, if we could use the word passive, they maybe feel more passive?
Mhm. So a little bit of context, we have an addiction coaching practice, and specifically porn addiction. So when guys are coming to us and we're working with them, they have reached a point where they know that something needs to change. And that's a huge advantage for us because otherwise this conversation is very difficult to broach. That being said, we still get a lot of resistance when we start talking about emotions where it's like, hey, I don't want to get touchy feely, all that. We get those resistances all the time. So
Yeah.
There's two things we do. Number one is we leverage the action-oriented nature of men. So we have a couple practical things that we will guide them through to help them get a little bit more in touch with their inner life. And I can talk about what those practical things are in a minute if that's helpful.
Yeah.
I think that's the first thing. The second thing is we have really built a community around this, around the value of understanding your inner life. And I think if you dive deeper into scripture, you look at the Psalms, for example, the Psalms are some of the most emotional, expressive texts that you will ever read in your life.
Right.
And most of the, well, actually, all of them are written by men, and primarily King David,
Yeah.
right? So there's lots of biblical arguments that I think get kind of neglected in this conversation. And that's often another leverage kind of point that we have with guys is to say, hey, there is actually a place for your emotions. We're going to teach you how to do it in a way that's healthy and biblical, like we were talking about earlier, and still masculine. And I think that's the clinching piece is they need to understand that there's still a masculine element to processing emotions beyond anger. And I think when you can demonstrate that, guys are generally a little bit more bought in, maybe still a little bit skeptical, but they'll at least try something with you.
Yeah, that's fascinating to me that there's this whole other side of needing to be masculine in processing an emotion. That's amazing. So you mentioned there are some ways that you encourage them to do that. What are some of those?
So there's two primarily. The first is we definitely recommend having conversations about it. And obviously, like I think I'm talking to women, and I think women might hear that and be like, duh. But for guys, like we're just not good at that. We don't do it naturally, especially as we go further on in life.
Yeah.
And being able to talk about this stuff a little bit more intimately is a real challenge for us. So again, in our community, we do group calls, like we facilitate these environments where this can happen a little bit more organically. But I would say before we even get there, the first thing that we teach guys is journaling
Mm.
and not writing in a diary. Okay, that's again another thing that guys are going to hear when they hear journaling, but journaling. We have a very specific, calculated method that helps men journal. You only need 5 minutes a day, but you could do it for 5 hours a day if you wanted to.
Right.
And it's just a mixture of, yeah, getting in touch with the deeper inner parts of your world and being able to articulate those more effectively. And then as well, leaving space to process, to hear the still small voice of God and to kind of invite him into your emotional world as well. So basically, all our journaling methodology is two parts. Number one is you express, and this is where you get permission to just write whatever's on your heart, not really with a lot of filters. We have a couple boundaries and guidelines around it, but generally it's just get it out. We give all of our clients the feel wheel. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
The feelings
Um,
wheel.
the feelings wheel. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So we give them the feel wheel because most of them don't have the language beyond I feel mad, I feel bad, I feel good. And I was that guy as well. So I'm not throwing shade there at all. I get it. And that's why the feel wheel has been so good for our community. That's the expression component. And then for the reflection part, we literally say, hey, put the pen down and quiet yourself and just start to reflect on what's going on. And this is a chance where often the Holy Spirit will speak, give revelation, give insights, and that sort of thing. So that's our journaling methodology, and that's what we encourage our guys to do. And most of them swear by it. They're always a little bit skeptical at first, but by the time they've done it a few times, they've had so much breakthrough, so much clarity. They feel a lot more in control of their lives because it's actually a powerless place to not know what's going on with your emotions.
Yeah.
And on the flip side, it's incredibly empowering to know what's going on in your inner world. And so a lot of guys actually love the power they get from it. They just didn't realize that it would have such a positive outcome.
Mm. Wow. So this is super insightful for me as a coach that works with women. How can we now, as women, support, encourage a guy, a spouse who is just like, we know that maybe they've got all these emotions inside, but we don't know how to help them start looking at their feelings, start noticing what's in there. If you could write a script for how a spouse, partner, person could help in that area, what would that look like?
Oh man.
I know
Okay.
that's a huge question, but and a
It,
general question, but just like
yeah.
where do we start this? Because I can hear, I can just sense, and even as a wife myself, I'm sensing like, wow, that sounds amazing. I wish my husband could do that if he would only do that. So how do
Right.
we help without being like, there's this guy that says, blah, 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 what
Yeah,
does
yeah.
that look like as a support or as somebody who can understand that process of a guy through this?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think in this area, like a guy talking about it is actually the most convincing for guys,
Mm,
especially a guy that they trust or more importantly, a guy that they respect.
yeah.
So what I always tell, and like we get a lot of women reaching out to us on Instagram and through our podcasts who say, hey, my husband's struggling with porn and he doesn't think it's a problem. how do I get him to realize this is a problem so that he'll do something about it? And so what I tell them is what I would tell somebody who wants to get their spouse more in touch with their inner world, which is number one, you have to figure out where does he go to get his most reliable information? Does he go to
Mm,
YouTube? Does he go to podcasts? Does he go to Instagram? And that's you wanna leverage the medium that he uses and send him content that you think is valuable, that you think he'll also find interesting. You
okay.
you have to somehow get it on his radar. Now, I'm not saying he's gonna love it. I'm not saying he's gonna watch everything that you send him. In fact, at first, he might brush you off.
Yeah.
But you
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
getting him a chance to at least hear the messaging and see it can really go a long way. And like I said, if it's coming from a man, it just is gonna hit differently. And then the second thing is starting to have some conversations about it. So if he does actually watch something, then figuring out like, what did you think about it? And he might, maybe he hated it. Maybe he's like, this is the stupidest thing I've ever seen. That's still great. He's at least telling you like what he thinks about it, and you can
Yeah.
have a conversation about it. So it's a slow play. There's no magic pill. There's no magic thing you can do, and all of a sudden he's going to be bought in. But if you're willing to like to entertain it a little bit more long term and play a long game, typically this approach has worked more with guys who are struggling with porn addiction, which I would say is a lot harder to get guys to overcome that mountain than to talk about their emotions.
Sure.
And generally, we've seen this process to be very, very effective, especially so this is the front facing part of it. The back end is sometimes guys, they don't understand the value. Like, what's in it for me to
Mm,
get more in touch with my emotions? That sounds like not a good use of my time. Sounds like it's going to create more problems, et cetera, et cetera. But then when your husband is now struggling to connect with his kid, that like there's an opportunity to insert like, hey, I wonder if they felt more of an emotional connection with you, if you might have been able to get a bit more further in that advice you were giving, et cetera, et cetera. So you kind of like lay a foundation, some groundwork with content, or like I call it seeding. And then at some point he's gonna encounter some sort of hardship, some sort of difficulty that is likely being caused by the neglect of his emotions. And that's where you can help him connect the dots. Again, I would say do it gently, but connecting the dots can really help him to start to see the value of, building these skills a bit more.
mm. Wow. That's very practical. And I think you did a great job of sharing about that in a way that respects the desire for a wife to want to help, but also respects the need for a guy to hear it in the right way
Mhm.
and for it to actually help them. Because that's a very tricky balance. Especially when as women, our perspective is we see something great. Maybe we're really learning about our emotions and we're changing and we're like, oh, I want to help. And the guy's like, whoa, wait, what? Like, so you're right. I think finding a way to make it matter to them, like you said, what's the point of doing this? Like,
Mhm.
why am I doing this? Like,
Yeah,
why does this matter? It's
100%.
just gonna dredge up all this junk in me. Like, I don't need more stuff in my life to deal with or work through, you know? So,
Yeah, they need
um,
to know what's in it for them for sure. And then the other big angle with guys is connecting emotional intimacy with sexual intimacy.
mm,
Because obviously most guys have a natural drive for sexual intimacy, and they don't understand how important emotional intimacy is to strengthen sexual intimacy in a relationship. So, that's another angle that I would use with guys.
okay.
I don't know maybe you can translate that for women, what they
Woo,
would do to maybe connect those dots. But that is like another, like, that's where we get a lot
yeah,
of buy-in, where it's like, hey, if
yeah.
you're having challenges in your sexual relationship, or you want a better sex life, probably enhancing emotional intimacy is going to be the easiest way for you to do that. Yeah.
Break that down for me though, from a guy's perspective. Like
Mhm.
you said, enhancing emotional intimacy will help with sexual intimacy. So,
Mhm.
how do you present that to a guy in terms of what that could look like? Better emotional intimacy to produce, you know what I'm saying? What is that?
Yeah, well, you would go
Uh,
reverse order with a guy for sure. You would definitely talk about having a better
Start with,
sex life.
yeah,
That'll get
right,
his attention for sure.
right.
So then this is where actually women get a chance to explain their side of the story, right? Because generally speaking, and again, I'm not going to typecast, and you're the expert, so please correct me if I'm wrong. I've been married 5 years, so this is what I've learned so far in my experience with my wife: is she needs emotional connection and intimacy first before she's really that interested in any kind of sexual activity.
Yes, absolutely.
And that's a little bit of an overstatement. Like, there are definitely times where we don't get a chance to bond or connect, and we still get to have sexual experiences. So it's not a perfect formula, but that's the general premise. Guys, reverse order. Like, we don't need it per se,
Right,
but at our core, we all actually want it. And I think that's the one thing that women may not know is we actually do want that emotional connection. And we feel the difference between when we have a sexual experience that is just naturally physical versus
right,
one that is
right,
beyond that.
right.
Any guy will tell you that. And they say things like, we know that sex complicates relationships if it's sex outside of marriage and all that kind of stuff. And we also know the difference between sexual experiences that we have in the context of a marriage versus those that were not. We know that something feels different about it, but we can't always put our finger on what that is. And if you ever ask a guy, what have been some of your most memorable sexual experiences? Usually there's actually a sentimental component to it. But again, unless somebody points it out, often we are just a little bit blind to it. We're kind of in the dark. So I think helping guys, educating guys, and making them realize there's two elements at play. Number one, your wife is going to be more interested in engaging with you sexually if she feels emotionally connected to you. That alone should be a clincher. Like that should be enough for a guy to say, okay, I guess I better learn how to build emotional intimacy because it's going to serve your wife. Your wife's going to show up better, and then you guys are going to have a better experience. Everybody wins.
Right.
But twofold, and secondly, is you like a lot of the guys I speak with, Christian guys, they're ashamed of their porn addiction. They feel like they've cheated on their wives. They did the thing they never thought they were going to do. And what they don't realize is if they would have focused on building an emotional relationship, an emotional intimacy with their spouse, the chances of them actually deviating towards pornography would have been a lot less.
Wow.
Because when your heart is actually full emotionally, you don't wander. You don't wander for those lusts of the flesh to nearly the same extent. It's
Yeah.
when you're void and you're empty and you're disconnected, that's when you're the most vulnerable. And I think explaining that to guys can be really helpful when they are having misbehaviors and compulsions that they're trying to get rid of, which most spouses of the people that are listening probably are watching pornography or struggling to some extent. So I think those are the two elements of that conversation.
Yeah, that's huge. And I think from a woman's perspective, if she is feeling that emotional fulfillment, she's, like you said, going to want to be more motivated. That is our first response. After we feel that emotional fulfillment, we want to respond physically. And so
Mhm. Mhm.
if we
Yes.
can if we can have that involvement too, that is also tampering the chance, you could say, of there being porn addictions and issues, affairs, other things, because we're more motivated, you're more motivated. Like it just works much better overall.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, we all want connection, right? It's
Right.
just that men and women get it through different ways. So
Yes.
you just have to learn how to kind of understand those dynamics and play into them. And
Okay.
it's the classic, like if you prioritize the other person, this is the big lie of pornography, right? Pornography tells you it's all about you and nobody else really matters
Right.
as long as you kind of get yours.
Right.
But we know biblical sexual intimacy is you prioritize the other person. And as long as you prioritize them and make sure they get what they want, you will pretty much always get what you need and what you want.
Very
I remember when I first got married, this was drilled into me when we were in premarital counseling. And when we got married, we went on a road trip to see some friends get married. And there's, I think, 8 of us. And so we carpooled, we rented this big Airbnb together. My wife and I were the only married couple. There was one other couple that had been dating, but they weren't married, and the rest were all single, mostly single guys. So the way the Airbnb was split up is like all the guys were in rooms and all the girls were in rooms, and there just weren't enough rooms for my wife and I to have our own room. So whatever, not a big deal. But we were just, newly married 3 weeks in. So kind of a big deal, but not a big deal. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So we're getting ready for the wedding. And a bunch of the guys, we're just in front of the mirror, we're doing our ties, whatever. And my wife pops in for a second. She just says, "Hey, like, how do I look? How does the dress look?" It was a new dress that she had bought for the wedding. And so I just look back and I say, "Oh, babe, you look amazing."
Mm.
And she just has a smile on her face and she walks out and she goes back and does her makeup and whatever. And I elbow the guy beside him to me and I say, "Hey, you see that?" And he goes, "Yeah." I said, "That's foreplay." And it, and he
Totally.
like looked at me like, "What? Like, what are you talking about?" And I'm like, "Dude, these things matter. Like, they matter a
Yes.
lot, way more than people realize." And we were just messing around, but the principle is there, right? And I think unless guys are taught that, unless they realize it, they're kind of just clueless about it. They think
Mm.
sex is just physical.
That is so powerful. Yes. So then again, I don't want to keep harping on this, but I want to help us understand better for this angle of how if a husband is somewhat unfamiliar or uncomfortable with their emotions, how can we as wives respectfully help them see some of the importances of emotional expression? Like how do we can say we could help in this area, can help in this area, but then it's like, how do we help it matter to them?
Yeah. Okay, so 2 things. Number 1 is there's a difference between saying it could help in this area versus asking the guy, "Do you think it would help in this area?"
Hmm. Okay.
So he needs to connect the dots. You can't connect the dots for him.
Oh,
And
yes,
so
that makes
if
sense.
you tell him,
Okay.
he does not get the opportunity to connect the dots. So asking very intentional questions can really go a long way. And I think that's probably the biggest thing. And the reason this is important is sort of my second point here, which is guys need psychological safety just as much as women do. And so the big thing that I think about with psychological safety is choice. So even with my spouse, with my wife, I don't like it when I feel pigeonholed to have to share something emotionally. Because as much as I've done work and I'm much better at explaining my emotions than I was 5 years ago, there's
Yeah.
still some days where I don't want to, or I actually don't know, and I'm just not ready to have the
Yeah.
conversation. And
Yeah.
if I feel like I have to share something, otherwise she's not going to be, satisfied or content or
Yeah.
whatever, that really reduces the safety. And at first she could feel like me pulling away, and then she would try to ask it differently and I would just clam up more. So
Yeah.
she's learned now she can kind of, because again, women are just very intuitive. They can tell when somebody's like got the wall up or there's something like kind of not there. And she's learned to just leave it. And her leaving it means that the next time she comes back and asks me, I'm going to be more inclined to share because
Mm.
she could sense the lack of safety. And so I think women can really leverage that their safety radars are a lot stronger than a guy's. A guy he might know what he does when he doesn't feel safe, but he might not be able to say, I don't feel safe. But a woman can tell, oh yeah, he's pulling back or he's a bit withdrawn or I got a wall up. And so, again, when you get that wall up, it's easy to get frustrated, like, "Oh, why is that wall there? I'm just trying to connect with you." But if you
Right.
can just respect, there's a reason that wall is there, and if you
Okay.
let him know, "Hey, even when he puts his walls up, he's still gonna be respected. He's not gonna be pushed to do anything that he's not comfortable doing or doesn't know how to do or whatever," that's actually gonna really, like, put a good deposit into the future so that the next time you do have a conversation like that, he might be more inclined to share. Because the last time he had a good experience where you honored his boundary or you honored his defense.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's really powerful. I think maybe we might perceive that our spouse or our husband is not sharing because they don't want to, or we can put all kinds of things on it. But it really, if you think about it from the terms of safety, safety in the sense that maybe they are like, I don't even know what that is, or I don't want to talk about it because it brings up something else. Like there could be lots of reasons for the safety to be threatened. Then
Mhm.
I think as a woman, we have a lot more compassion for that than just, why won't you talk to me about this? You
Definitely.
know?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so too, and I think especially your audience is gonna be a lot more attuned, a lot more mature in this
Right.
area. So,
Yeah.
yeah, they would have that capacity for it. You prompted a thought, something I was gonna mention, but yeah, the safety element definitely it goes a long way for guys as well.
Mm, okay.
Yeah.
All right. And that's kind of that relates to this next question and kind of tying all together. What tips do you have to help a wife approach an emotionally charged topic in a way that's going to strengthen the relationship versus maybe cause the walls to go up or cause there to be that concern of, I don't want to share about this?
Yeah, can you give me an example?
Well, like if you feel like there is some emotional issue in the relationship that you're like, I wish you could be more like this. And like you could share more about this side of yourself. Like you could share
Mm,
more about what you're struggling with or what some of your goals are behind this year. Just different things like that where you're like, I know that is kind of an emotionally charged topic, or maybe it's caused a fight in the past.
mm,
Like we don't want to just avoid that, but how do we bring that up in a way that doesn't feel like it's going to be even
yeah.
more emotional?
Yeah, so I think we'll make the assumption that the husband that you're talking to is very closed off and emotionally, like, at a level 0.
Okay.
Because obviously it's gonna depend, some people might be fortunate, may be able to get there faster. If
Yeah.
you have somebody that's really walled off, you have to meet them where they're at.
Mm,
So, if you're talking about yeah, let's say you're talking about finances, like something that's really charged,
yeah.
um, and you just notice, like, anytime there's financial stress, he's just a different person, like, he's clearly, like I don't know if there's trauma history or what there is, but,
Yeah.
like, financial stress clearly gets him. Big one for guys in general. If you ask him, like, "Hey, was there something in your childhood that caused this?" Like, you're just not gonna get anything from asking those kinds of questions. If you ask him, "Why are you stressed?" You're probably not gonna get, like, a super helpful answer. So the first thing is, if somebody is emotionally charged and you as the woman, you're the one with more emotional capacity, you have a little bit more maturity, the question I would be asking is, how do I keep the emotional climate as relaxed as possible? Because I will say, like, my wife, there's been a couple times where I have like started to fly off the handle, and my wife has stayed totally calm. And because she doesn't react to me, I'm like, oh, what am I doing?
Yeah.
Like when she reacts to me, that's when I fly off the handle. It kind of like spurs me further.
Yeah.
But she also has that ability to anchor me. And so sometimes just like if women are demonstrating the things that you teach them here on this podcast, that can actually really go a long way to number one, just making sure the environment is at least relaxed enough that maybe there's a coherent conversation that can be had.
Yeah.
I think the second thing is if you use less emotional language, but it's still getting you to emotional places, that can be really valuable. So, example, Like, if you ask, like, "Why do you feel this way about money?" That may not get the best response. Again, it depends on your husband, but we're making
Sure.
an assumption that you have
Sure.
somebody who's not emotional at all.
Right.
Versus if you ask, "Why is this so important to you?" So any the most closed off guy can still answer why finances are important to him. And so I think just learning to meet them where they're at, having those conversations goes a long way. And then, we get a lot of parents who come to us and are like, "Hey, I think my kid might be watching pornography or my kid's starting to get on technology. How do I make sure he doesn't watch porn?" And the one thing that we always tell them, and it's very, very applicable to this conversation as well, is you don't have a conversation with your kid and then they never watch porn and they have a healthy relationship with sex and everything's good to go. It's an ongoing discussion, but the earlier you have that conversation and the more they have positive experiences with you having those conversations, the more likely they are to come to you when they find some explicit material online or something like that. And with your husband, it's sort of the same thing. If you can play a long game and make it the goal over the next like year or two to start to build some more safety and get him to open up a bit more, it means that there's not so much pressure on one conversation. And if you blow it or it doesn't go the way you expected, it's okay, you can come back. But if you just make it your goal to kind of get like 1% closer and get him to open up a little bit more each and every time, I think that kind of approach goes a lot further. And then he's not going to feel like the pressure or feel like you have some sort of ulterior motive in the
Yeah.
question asking.
Yeah. No, that's super helpful. And I think that switching of the phrasing of the question is always so important in these
Hmm.
male female dynamics.
Hmm.
So, are there other questions that could be helpful for a woman to kind of open up this world of emotions? I know, again, that's kind of a general thing, but are there specific words to avoid and words that are helpful to do this? Again, encouraging the safety with a guy.
Probably a little bit more dependent on the person. I don't know
Sure.
about specific words, but like I said, less sentimental language. Like me 7, 8 years ago, I responded a lot better to less sentimental language. Like I'm a different person now, and when somebody's matured, you can obviously just be more direct.
Right.
I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I'd be really considering having those conversations and making sure that you're doing them well. Language to use. So the other thing would be, as a woman, I would be asking, like, what are you really after? So, for example, let's say the financial stress comes up again and again. You're very familiar with your in-laws, and you know exactly where this is all coming from, but maybe he's not really talking about it or whatever. So, if you wanted to like try to broach that subject a little bit about what it was like growing up or where some of these mindsets around money came from, you can ask those questions, like, in relatively uninvasive ways, like saying, like, "What were some of your earliest experiences with money like?" Or and you can even frame it in the positive, that might be the thing that actually gets in there is like, "What's, like, one of your fondest memories with money growing up?"
Mm,
And he may realize, "I actually don't have any fond memories," right? And now you have an open door.
yeah.
Or he does have some experiences, and at least you're delving like, if you wanna get into the childhood stuff,
Mhm.
that's a really great way for you to get there, but to get there, I guess, gently and safely. Again, these are all starters, like, hopefully, it doesn't end there, and I don't want this to feel too, like, doomy and gloomy for women,
Well,
but sometimes you just have to meet them where they're at, start small, but
yeah.
eventually you can obviously get into those deeper places.
Right. And I would say too, as someone who's been married almost 25 years, I feel like we have grown and changed. We have 4 kids. One of them is 22. Like we've definitely changed over the years and how we
Wow.
parent and how we grow and all these things. And so naturally we have grown individually and emotionally. I have learned that as I have grown and my husband has grown in other areas, like there are growth that has to happen that can happen as a couple together in those conversations. And then there's
Mhm.
growth that happens with you and the Lord, where maybe you have the conversation with your spouse and you're learning, oh, this is what, like we're talking about the money thing. Okay, this is what happened with him growing up, whatever. You may not get to that resolution with him right there. It
Mhm.
might be you take what you've learned and then you bring it to God and like, okay, so then where does that come from? How do I process what he shared? What do I do with this? Versus I think in the beginning of marriage, I was very much focused on, well, it's just us and we need to figure this out. Like, I feel like there's
Yeah.
that third element of the Lord and me just kind of processing on my own of some of these issues. And also the other side of he is not needing to be my complete emotional fulfillment, which I think a lot of women struggle with in this area of emotions is they want their husband to be the one who's fulfilling all these things. And if he
Yeah.
isn't, then so yeah. So I have you seen that to be true in your marriage too, where there's just some things that like emotionally you can process together, but some sides of that, you just need to kind of do it separately with the Lord and kind of let it be worked out.
Mhm. Definitely. So we actually help guys identify like what kind of processor are you?
Mm,
And there's two questions you need to ask yourself. Number one is, do you process verbally, or do you like to contemplate or write things down? Like, is it expressive or is it a little bit more internal? And then
yeah.
the second question is, do you prefer to do it alone or do you prefer to do it with another person? So my wife is verbal processor, loves talking about stuff, and like always needs another person. Like she could do it all the time.
Yeah.
And I'm the complete opposite. So I'm like on my own. I want my journal. I want to
That's
write it.
my
It's just
husband.
me and the Lord. Nobody sees it.
Yes. Yes.
And once I kind of have like a summary,
Yeah.
or whatever, then I'm like ready to talk. And it doesn't mean I won't go back into the details, but that's how I get to my place. So we've had to learn that over the years,
Totally.
and respect it. We still have conversations about me meeting my wife's expectation of what I can provide for her. Because
Right.
as much as I have more emotional capacity and I've gotten better, I still don't like my capacity feels like I'm a quarter cup and she's got
Sure.
2 cups worth of emotions to process with me. So I still have to learn to communicate my boundaries and to do it in love so
Right.
that she doesn't feel rejected, she doesn't feel like she's too much, and that we're also at the same time finding other ways that she can still process verbally so that she feels like her heart's getting what it needs. And I really think that's where going to God first is the most important thing, because I think he's really the only person with truly like the not just enough capacity, but the right capacity for our hearts.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's something we've worked through. And then we just became parents in the last year and a half. So we've had to work through it all over again as our capacities have shifted. So definitely.
Oh my gosh, that's so great. And then, yeah,
Yeah.
I second that. When I learned that my husband was an internal processor, and I accepted it, let me just say that side, because
Mm.
I was like, why can't we just talk about it right now? Like, why can't we just work this out? And it's very easy if you're that person who wants to process right now to almost become a bully. Like, let's go, let's deal with this.
Yeah.
Like, don't shy away because then we won't talk about it. Like, you could just, but you have to, once I began to understand and respect that, then I was like, okay, I'm going to just put the little pearl out there of this is the thing, right? Let him
Hmm.
kind of percolate on it and then ask, can we talk about this maybe in a day or two after you've had a chance to process? Yes. Okay,
Hmm.
great. Right. Then it's like
Yeah.
freedom, right? It's so much, it saves so much. So I think understanding each other is huge in that. But
Yes. And the internal processors have to hold up their end of the deal, which is that you actually do come back and talk about it.
amen, right?
'Cause I'm preaching to the choir, 'cause, like, I've been notorious
Oh,
for that, where it's like, I just felt so relieved that we didn't have to rush into it, that
yes.
it then I, like, kind of forgot about it, 'cause I processed it, and then I just moved on, right? 'Cause I don't
Yes.
need the verbal element, I don't need it, but she does. And
Yes.
so we had to actually shorten the time windows, 'cause when it was, like, 3 or 4 days, it was like a lost cause. So it's,
Amen.
like,
Oh
a
my
few
gosh.
hours, maybe a day or 2 max, but, like, it's always specific, and I have to be the one to initiate it, 'cause it's not fair to her, like, she's ready to talk about it, and I'm not. So if she's gonna give me the space, the least I can do is then come back at the time we agreed on and talk
So
about it.
true. Yes. Yes. Right. That's the fear of a verbal processor is that it won't come back to be talked about. That I'm going
Right.
to give you this rope to think about it, and then it's just going to get swept under the rug, and life happens, and la 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 la.
Yeah.
So yeah, if we can, and I appreciate that as a someone who is an internal processor, you're like, I want to at least be the one to bring it up. I think that says a lot to a verbal processor. So man,
Yeah.
there's so much we could talk about. There's so much we could talk about here. So I am grateful for this conversation with you. Thank you for what you've shared. And I know that there are people, men for sure, who are listening, and women who might be like, hey, well, this guy sounds like he's got some good stuff to send to my husband, like he was talking about. Well, how can people get in touch with you and learn more about what you're offering as programs and such?
Yeah, I really enjoyed this conversation, actually. This is a lot of fun. So I'm excited to have you on my show, and
Yeah.
then we'll get to kinda get the other side of it. So that would be my main recommendation is people go check out the podcast. It's called The Man Within, very appropriate for what we discussed today.
Yeah.
But over 800 episodes on there, and we talk about the whole gamut of men's health and well-being through a biblical lens. And I used to be a university researcher, so we offer, the scientific component there as well. And so the Man Within podcast, lots of content there, and I think that'd be a great place for your audience to check out.
Sweet. Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on and talking to us today. This has been so valuable.
Thanks for having me, Alicia.
Yeah. Thanks. I don't know about you, but that was extremely insightful for me. And I am a person, obviously, who deals in the world of emotions and works with women every day in this area. It was powerful for me to hear a lot of the principles that we talk about from the perspective of a guy and to then be able to say, okay, how can I help myself and my relationship by presenting these things in a way that is a blessing and isn't going to cause more tension. And not from the standpoint of he's wrong, he's bad. I think sometimes when we maybe have a guy who we were using the example in that conversation of a guy who maybe isn't as emotionally in touch with his feelings as a zero is like kind of where we're starting from. I mean, and the person you may be thinking of maybe a zero, they may be a seven on a scale of 1 to 10. There's obviously a varied arrangement, but if we feel like we are more emotionally in touch with what's going on, there is this feeling that we can have of, well, I need to help you, or I need to, like, there's somehow lesser than. And I really appreciated that that doesn't have to be the perspective that we take in our conversations with our spouses and loved ones in this, that we can respect where someone is at emotionally, and we can lovingly present what we're feeling and give them space to grow wherever they're at, or give them space to absorb and process, like in terms of how they're processing. That was huge, I think, for all of us to understand that not everybody is a verbal processor and not everybody's an internal processor. But I think just so many of the things in this conversation can go a long way in helping any relationship, specifically a marriage. So I am curious. I would love to be able to continue this conversation with you on Instagram. What are some of the nuggets that you took from this that you're like, I am going to use that concept or this idea to help me as I am relating to my husband in this way right now, wherever he's at emotionally? I'm going to use this as a way to enrich my marriage right now. Reach out to me on Instagram. It's at Alicia Michelle Coach. I would love to have these conversations with you and to talk to you more about that. All right. If you'd like more information on how to get connected with Sathiya, he gave the name of his podcast there in our conversation, and it was The Man Within. But you can also go directly to his website, which is Sathiya Sam, and that's spelled SathiyaSam.com/podcast. And that's where they have over 800 episodes that they have done on the Man Within podcast. And so you can search there to see what kind of content would be helpful for you and learn more about the work that he does in his community. All right, friends, I hope this conversation was a great insight for you. It sparked a lot of ideas of what you might be able to do differently, maybe to relate to your spouse or your partner in your relationship. And again, I encourage you to bring these things before the Lord and see how he may want you to apply some of this. Take care, and I'll see you back here next week. Thanks for joining me today for the Christian Mindset Coach. If you loved today's show, would you take 2 seconds and share a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts? I've got a special gift for you when you share a review, my amazing 50 I Am declarations, 50 statements and Bible verses about who you are in Christ. This is an audio meditation and a written statement that is extremely popular with my clients, and I want to give you access just for sharing your Apple Podcast review. Simply screenshot your review and send it to hello@vibrantchristianliving.com, and we'll send you the link to access the 50 I Am Declarations resource. Thanks so much for sharing your rating and review so that we can get the word out about the podcast. See you back here next week.